Yeah, okay, and if you're coming in at the last bit, there are chairs up here in the front. You have to be in the front if you come in now. Okay, that's great. Welcome. I'm Steve Polasky. I'm at the University of Minnesota, where I have a joint appointment between the Department of Ecology and the Department of Applied Economics. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to the introduce us to the panel discussion today on climate change, land use, and biodiversity, economic perspectives. So I'm going to give a few kind of opening remarks about this, and then co-organize this with Eyal from the University of Chicago, and he will introduce the panelists. And then we'll have the panelists speak, and then plenty of time for questions and answers. So please be thinking about your questions, because as I said, we'll have plenty of time for that at the end, unless you guys go on too long. But we'll cover. Okay, so to me, this is the topic of the hour or the decade or the century, if you want. So we need to think about both, we've worked for a while that there is a crisis of both biodiversity and climate, and that these are interacting challenges. We know that they're intertwined, so climate change is a major threat to biodiversity. We also know that biodiversity or nature or land use can do a lot for climate change, both in terms of, if you think about where emissions are coming from, 25 to 33%, depending on which study you read, are from land use and agriculture, forestry, and so forth, as well as thinking about adaptation strategies, so nature-based solutions. And as I say, we've known about the climate and nature crises or as major threats for decades, right? So go back to 1992, the Earth Summit, formerly the UN Conference on Environment and Development. There were two major conventions that came out of that conference: the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Following this, there have been the formation of scientific bodies. Well, actually, IPCC, we all know, actually preceded that. But more recently, we've had IPBES, which is, and I'll only say it once because it's very long, is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Right? Just say IPBES. Okay. So we have scientific bodies, we have conventions, we have international agreements. We know that for climate, we have the Paris Agreement, for example, right? That says we need to limit emissions, we need to limit emissions so that we don't have dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate, so less than 2 degrees, hopefully 1.5 degrees, no more. We also have on the biodiversity side the recently negotiated Kunming Montreal Global Framework for Biodiversity. So we have policies globally agreed upon, we have scientific bodies, and yet we don't have progress on these issues. So if you look at climate change and if you look at biodiversity, the trends are still going in the wrong direction. I also want to mention, so I've been talking about international, but we also have national level policies and assessment. And Heather, I'm sure you'll talk a little bit more about some of these, but we have the National Climate Assessment, and we are going to be having the National Nature Assessment. And all of these assessments, both domestically and internationally, have pointed out that the trends are going in the wrong direction. Okay, so I was reading this morning's paper, actually just on the web, and it came across several quotes. Let me just read them. And actually, with age, I actually need glasses for this. So in The Guardian this morning, there was a short story about the population of breeding birds in the UK have dropped by 30% or more in the past decade. It is the umpteenth reminder that nature is in crisis. Yet these losses don't seem to be creating a sense of urgency for those in power. Then from the New York Times, New Delhi recorded its highest temperature ever measured on Wednesday, 126 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving residents of the Indian capital sweltering in the heat wave that has kept temperatures in several Indian states well above 110 degrees for weeks. Those of you who have read Ministry for the Future, this may sound familiar. Okay, so today is not particularly special in the news. I think on a random day, I could have come across other stories about nature and climate change. And as economists, I think there's a huge role for economists in this addressing these interlinked challenges. So to borrow a line from the Paul Simon song, what are we going to do about it? That's what I want to know. So, economists, we can talk about costs and benefits of alternative policies and management decisions. We can talk about the design of incentives to address these issues through policies and market mechanisms. We're good at accounting for unintended consequences and feedbacks of interventions, and thinking about the long-term and macroeconomic impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to turn it over to Eyal, who will introduce our wonderful panel. And you probably know many or all the people on this panel. They're quite a distinguished group. And we chose them because they have experience not only in academia and inside of economics, but also because they have experience in the private sector and in government and international organizations and NGOs. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I'm just going to go on proximity to me. I'm going to start with Heather Tallis, who works as an independent advisor to Bridge Nature, the economy, and people's lives. She served as President Biden's policy advisor on nature in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she drove cross-agency action on nature-based solutions, advanced efforts to account for nature and benefit cost analysis, and with the U.S. Global Change Research Program, created the National Nature Assessment. She previously worked at the Nature Conservancy Natural Capital Project. To her left, we have Juha Siikamaki, who is the chief economist and head of the economy and finance team of the International Union of Conservation of Nature, or as you know, the IUCN. He is also a member of the editorial board and technical committee as the System of Environmental Economic Accounting and Ecosystem Accounting, which you know as the SEEA. You move it away with acronyms, it looks like. And prior to joining IUCN in 2017, he worked on resources for the future. Left to Mafulo, who is the co-founder of Fractal, an investment platform built to drive adoption of regenerative practices at scale by providing farmers with capital to invest in their operations, while investors get exposure to high-quality farmland. She previously led the Cortiva Art Science team responsible for the development of Cortiva's soil carbon program. Left to Emma, we have Richard Damania, who is the chief economist of Sustainable Development Practice Group. His work has spanned across multiple sectors on matters relating to environment, water, and the economy. Prior to joining the World Bank, he was a professor of economics at the University of Eyal. And to the left of Richard, we have Kathleen Segerson, who is a Paul Trustee's distinguished professor of economics at the University of Connecticut. Her research focuses on the incentive effects of alternative environmental policy instruments, and she has a strong interest in collaborative interdisciplinary work. Dr. Segerson is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of AERE. She also is a past president of AERE. With that, I'm going to ask you and just pass the microphone along. One point stop to mind about the intersection of climate change and biodiversity, the good, the bad, and the beautiful.
Okay, I thought I was going last, so I'm going to go first. Great, so I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the recent U.S. policy changes that have addressed biodiversity and climate, and in my view, created a lot of opportunities and in fact needs for economic research. So I'm going to try and give you brief introductions to those policies and then tee up what I think that the research opportunities are. So I'm going to start with nature-based solutions. In 2022, the Biden administration released the Nature-Based Solutions National Roadmap, which is a national government strategy on nature-based solutions, encouraging the government to do everything possible to unlock the full potential of nature-based solutions for the climate for equity and for economic prosperity. That roadmap was put out by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Council on Environmental Quality, I'm skipping all the acronyms, and the Climate Policy Office, along with 15 other agencies. So it was a really cross-government approach. It is full of recommendations for how government can change across its functions, from policies to funding programs to managing federal assets and facilities to the workforce to science and research priorities. I want to point out one of the principles that's in that roadmap, because it really attempts to fundamentally shift the starting point for agencies thinking about nature. Up to this point, it's pretty much on the agencies to justify, if they want to take an approach that invests in nature, why that makes sense, and to justify that it's appropriate. There's a principle in the roadmap that says, literally, start with nature. So I'm going to read the principle. Agencies should promote and integrate nature-based solutions whenever possible, unless alternatives are demonstrated to be more beneficial when the full range of benefits are considered. So I'm sure for all of you economists, you just heard BCA, BCA, BCA. But basically the point is agencies are asked across all agencies to start with the assumption that nature might be relevant to their agency's mission and what they're trying to get done for society. So that's a huge shift, right, in the starting point for agencies to think about nature. That's a set of recommendations. Doesn't require anybody to do anything. And so I want to mention another policy action that happened that does direct agencies to take that seriously. So the very sexy named Office of Management and Budget Memo M2403. I encourage you to look up, came out late last year or mid last year, and it is focused on climate smart infrastructure and disaster resiliency planning. This was really shepherded by one of my colleagues, Chris Clavin, in the Office of Management and Budget, and this is an OMB management memo to all agencies. So in short, this is a cross-cutting agency directive, now not a recommendation, that's focused specifically on infrastructure. This memo includes best practice recommendations for federal funding programs around infrastructure to leverage nature-based solutions to increase resiliency for infrastructure. So I'll just remind you all that in the last couple of years, we have had literally trillions of dollars of federal funding directed to infrastructure through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. This memo applies to all of that funding and all other infrastructure funding in the federal government. And this includes a directive to agencies to strongly encourage them to help applicants incorporate nature-based solutions in infrastructure siting, design, construction, operation, and maintenance, and use those approaches unless alternatives are demonstrated to be more beneficial to society when the full range of benefits are considered. So there's the recommendation language in the direct directive to agencies to incorporate nature-based solutions. And so far this year, I've tracked funding offerings coming out of several agencies, and we've seen from DOT, FEMA, HUD, at least billion-dollar programs that include language that encourages nature-based solutions. So it's happening, and so I'll get to why that's important to you all, but I want to give one more policy example. That directive is focused on infrastructure, under the current OMB. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is also promulgating a new rule right now. There are principles, requirements, and guidelines that's in draft. The final draft, just went for public comment that closed last month. And in that draft, the Army Corps is proposing for all of their water planning projects that the final array of options that's considered for any water planning project under that guidance to include a nature-based alternative. So that means if this is finalized, every Army Corps project that goes under these guidelines has to at least consider a full nature-based option for whatever social benefit it's trying to provide. Again, all of this is evidence-based, right? They're not forcing anyone to do nature-based solutions because they won't always make sense. But the language is now there in several fundamental policies that ask for them to be significantly considered on the basis of evidence. So what I think this tees up, it is major calls to agencies and to people applying for agency funding to be able to design nature-based solutions with the intention of providing social benefits. So probably all of you are familiar with most of the literature that established the evidence base that let these policies actually happen came from research on conservation interventions, right? Conserving an existing forest or wetland and measuring flood risk reduction outcomes. Restoring riparian areas or areas along roadways and measuring erosion risks. Those are conservation interventions that have been evaluated. And now agencies are all being asked to design infrastructure, roads, bridges, housing with nature in mind, which is a very different set of interventions. So I think there's a huge opportunity now to make this easy for agencies and applicants by putting out the research that puts forward these kinds of design criteria and design options and evaluates them from the perspective of providing social benefits and aiding the environment. It might sound like a tweak, but in the policy world, having to do translation means stopping progress. And so having a research base that's ready-made for people to be able to understand how can I design for these outcomes will really speed up what these policies can do. I want to mention another set of policy changes now on benefit cost analysis, right? I mentioned these policies are asking people to consider nature-based solutions on the basis of evidence and consider what kinds of costs and benefits they might provide. So conventional federal benefit cost analysis is not the strongest for considering ecosystem services, which are many of those benefits you'd want to account for. And so major updates to the guidance on benefit cost analysis for the entire federal government have happened in the last couple of years. So more sexy name documents, Circular A4 and Circular A94 are the Office of Management and Budget policies that set the rules for all federal BCA. And those have been updated for the first time in 20 or 30 years, depending on the document. And so these are major evolutions, major opportunities for so much research and evolution and thinking to come into policy practice. And that's happened with specific emphasis on making sure agencies pay attention to ecosystem service costs and benefits for any policy and for any project, not just those that have an environmental intention. And so to really emphasize that point, OMB also released a new first of its kind specific guidance. I'm going to read it slowly. The guidance for assessing changes in environmental and ecosystem services in benefit cost analysis. That is the title of this new guidance, and it is specifically focused on how the government hopes to see agencies consistently evaluating ecosystem service changes. In this context, these guidance is applied to both regulatory impact analysis, so any meaningful rule changes, but also to project and program benefit cost analysis. So anytime a BCA is being done, whether it's for a policy or a program, these guidelines apply. So I think the huge opportunity here is that now, of course, the resource agencies have a lot of capacity to do these kinds of analyses, but other agencies don't. And they don't have a lot of exposure to how to do these analyses well. These guidelines are new, and it's going to take time for them to be widely adopted. And it would be incredibly helpful for there to be published examples in the literature of applying these guidelines with specific details to government programs or policies. And so if you are looking for new research projects or have students who look at the reg agendas for next year, see what policies are coming up, do regulatory impact analyses on them and publish them. These guidelines are high level. And so the specifics of which data would you use, which ecosystem services would you assess, how would you make the baseline that includes future changes in climate and social changes and demographics. All of that now needs to be demonstrated in a robust way so it's clear what this guidance can look like in practice. Because this is new, the administration also established a new subcommittee that's called the Frontiers of Benefit Cost Analysis. And I want to flag that this subcommittee will now be putting out an annual report that identifies research priorities and needs for the federal government to do benefit cost analysis more robustly. The first one was released at the end of last year. There'll be another one at the end of this year. And I'll just briefly mention a couple of the priorities that they identified as needs. A major area of need was around ecosystem services. And they mentioned specific data gaps on things like certain habitat extents, like deep sea corals, certain preferences for ecosystem services like tribal and indigenous preferences for cultural use of coral reefs, Issues that have other distributional significance, like subsistence fishery use rates by different groups and so on. So there's a long list in the appendix of that report of specific research needs. It's a great opportunity for you to be able to see exactly what decision makers need. Probably way over time. Should I wrap it up? I'll make just two brief points that are general, just reflecting on the experience that I had in the last couple of years. I never worked in government before, and I just had a 2.5-year very close-up look at what it means for research to be policy useful. And I very intentionally differentiate policy relevant from policy useful. And I'll just blame myself first and then invite you all. I have done a lot of research that I thought was policy relevant, and it was not policy useful. So I just want to briefly say a lot of, I think, what's in the literature is foregrounded on sort of first best options. What's the optimal thing we can do? What's the best set of outcomes we could achieve? What's the most efficient way to get to something? And those are almost always politically dead on arrival. And so Steve coined a term yesterday when you were talking about this that I'm going to perpetuate and encourage this community to establish actionable best options, which are what you can imagine as practically implementable, politically viable scenarios, options, alternatives, and evaluate them robustly and rigorously. We have a lot of experience from NatCap project days of decision makers telling us what they want, and it being a sort of unsatisfying incremental step. Analyze it anyway, and then put out the next step that might be more ambitious so that they can see the comparison. But over and over in the last couple of years, we tried to draw directly from the literature, and there's things that are so far away from what's possible now, it's very, very difficult to translate them into an immediate policy action. And the last thing I'll say is it's really, really important for the scientific community writ large to make very clear to the world what we agree on. We are all incentivized and will continue to be special and experts and the best and most novel at everything. And we all have to write papers that say this is the new thing we found that no one else has ever said before. And in a policy context, it's really, 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 really important to know what everybody agrees on. And so I know this happens. There are plenty of papers that do syntheses or meta-analyses or sort of stock takes of where the science stands, but I cannot overemphasize how important they are and how especially important they are to come out from the scientific community with translation to the current policy moment. So you all know what the issues are that the administration is dealing with. This doesn't just apply in the US, those could be global issues. To take time and use funding and use effort to convene scientists to come out with consensus statements is incredibly, incredibly important. Because scientists in these roles who understand where the community is can say those things, but then if we're asked to point to a paper that reinforces those 3 core points and we can't identify them, it's our word against somebody else's argument. So I just want to put that out as a general call to the community as you continue to think about and work on these issues. Please use your voices and your influence to make as clear what we agree on as much as what's novel and new and exciting. Thank you.
Shall I? Thanks very much, Heather. So first of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel with very distinguished speaker colleagues here. Extremely happy to be at the AERE conference. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk more from my perspective and experience from international organizations, and very much focusing on biodiversity and nature. But before I jump, and sort of touching on the levels of economics and how we as economists can contribute to these issues. But before I jump into the rest of my discussion, I'll say a few words about IUCN. You're not very familiar with us. IUCN is a membership organization founded in 1937 to work on supporting conservation and sustainable use of nature. IUCN has about 1,400 members from all the governments, but also civil society members. And there are two key aspects, two entrepreneurs that IUCN uses to contribute. And one has to do with supporting international policy development, national policy development, and especially as a second approach, providing data and knowledge so that those policies will be based on the vast data. So one example there is IUCN register of species. So we hear that about 1 million species are threatened by extinction. It's not, but IUCN is not responsible for those threats, but IUCN can be thanked for documenting those threats, and we actually know how they are describing those threats. I'm now jumping onto the specific here in terms of role of economics in this space. Of course, economists themselves, and we've worked on this issue for a long time, and sustainable development is not nothing new. It goes back to 70s and 80s. And so the role of understanding economics as a driver of nature loss has been around for a long time. But in my almost 7 years of presence in this field, I think I saw that initially I thought that the economics was going to be less to the issues than I had anticipated. But this has changed over the last few years, and there's a number of key issues that have played into this. And still, that's the sort of a general recognition of the loss of biodiversity and the threat it poses not only on species, but also as to economies and human well-being is one. Again, to recognition there. And I feel that economics has sort of made a long step into mainstreaming of these discussions. One key step here is actually the Basket review. So, Basket review, it's very familiar to those of us working in this field. We had a significant impact in making those issues among economists and the field in general. And so the idea of the economy being embedded in nature rather than being just sort of a separate entity from nature is well received and well understood. So economy, human society, embedded in nature, that resonates to many audiences here. I think there's another concept that has helped us make entry point here, that has to do with natural capital. Again, a very familiar concept for economists in this space, but now it is generally recognized that nature, can be considered as a form of economic asset, and said economic asset either so having that loss or it claims it means that there's an economic loss associated with that. And how do we measure that loss? How do we measure that in the trade-off of near-term gains versus long-term losses is a key area that is an actual space for economists to contribute and speak to the audiences that actually learn us this information. A related concept has to do with the actual economy. And we systems have been in development for there's been a shift over the last few years in developing those accounting systems. We're familiar with this from the national capital strategy of the Biden administration and the commitment and strategy to integrate nature in the national accounts over the next 15 years. So this is an ambitious strategy to bring nature into accounting on the metrics. There's a ecosystem accounting system of economic accounting that was adopted as an international standard in 2021. So I've been around now for about 3 years, and many countries are starting to implement this. And as countries start to implement the accounting frameworks, it becomes more familiar to users and audiences around the world working on these issues. These topics, of course, are not related only to the public sector, but there's a great deal of work and importance in private sector in terms of understanding impacts and dependencies and risks related to natural capital. And here one key development is a task force for nature-related financial disclosures that provides a framework for companies to understand how they evaluate nature, their risk, how they face financial risks, related to, say, degradation and loss of nature, and how they are then impacting through their activities on nature. And really, of course, the purpose is not only to provide a snapshot of these relationships, but to actually encourage, even mandate corporations to disclose those dependencies and risks, and then implement them on them. And then, as a person, important development is the most continuing natural global biodiversity framework. And this is an international agreement similar to the Paris Agreement in that context that addresses biodiversity loss. So this was a joint realization in May 2022 in Montreal. And it is a framework that is very comprehensive. It lists also goals and targets related to conservation of nature, protection, and so forth. But it's also a framework that, I think for the first time, very serious way, takes into consideration the need to align economic activities with conservation. So rather than just thinking that, such and such number, such and such billions of dollars of funding to support conservation, how do we actually go about aligning economy more generally with nature? We recognize funding is very important, if we can make a big difference there, but even the greatest amounts of funding would only amount to a fraction of a percent of, say, economic activities as measured GDP in total. So we would be foolish to think that spending a fraction of a percent on conservation will somehow be able to change the trajectories that are proven in many ways by the 99% of the rest of the GDP, for example. So that how to align economic activities with nature in a way that is effective and meaningful, there is a great role for economists. And prior to all these developments, I wanted to mention the concept of nature-based solutions that Heather already mentioned about. This is, of course, recognized in the context of climate, that nature is not only impacted by climate change, but can greatly contribute to mitigating climate change. And how to make this happen in practice is a key contribution where economists are needed. And one specific area where it's actually a sort of measurement frameworks. How do we understand the outcomes associated with nature-based solutions as they relate to climate, biodiversity, other social goals, and how do we then use that information to design nature-based solutions that are effective and desirable from the economic perspective. I'm going to move towards just highlighting a few key areas. Not many areas, but some key areas that I see as areas of interest and contributions to economists. We've been working on benefit cost analysis for a long time. I think there's still a need for that work, providing the best data on the benefits and costs of conservation action. We should think about this. The idea of nature being kind of surrounding us, economy being embedded in nature. There's a way to better understand the dynamics between nature and economy. Of course, understanding how economic activities impact nature, but also how nature then, through feedbacks and dynamics, creates economic benefits. How they work in different contexts, different scales. Is an area where economists are naturally positioned to contribute. The great deal of need to understand the role of different policy instruments, how they work to advance conservation goals, where they work, what their advantages are. And here, I think specific opportunity might be to learn from the climate policy and really understand what are the kinds of policy learnings and experiences that would translate from the climate context to nature context, and why, but also understand what are the kinds of policy instruments, so market mechanisms, offsets, credits, that may have a different path in working in the conservation world. There's a great deal of to learn from the climate policy and help nature related ones is to just learn from those findings, but also maybe talk a little bit and then go through the experiences and learnings only from the nature arena. And finally, of course, there's a long literature on evidence of conservation kind of impact theories, measuring conservation impacts. There's a great deal of especially when you consider that the conservation world sort of works in very narrow frames. So years are very short, decades might be short. So how do we actually assess the impact frameworks of conservation instruments when our time horizons are counted in days of years rather than years? So we have to do that, and lots of contribution, but lots of contribution for learning ahead too. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, the comment about private sector is helpful because that's where I'm going to take us next. So before I sort of start on my comments, just to give you a little bit of context about sort of the path and the experience I'm speaking from. So I actually got into this space as a PhD in ecology. Right, my focus was entirely on conservation and wildlife. I ended up studying commercial fisheries because I thought sort of working lands and working waters was where we were going to have the biggest impact, right? And most direct linkages between economics and ecology, right? So where fish school, what kinds of migratory patterns do they have? How does that interact with the type of fishing vessels that you might have, sort of prey switching or species switching, markets that you have access to? Those sorts of direct intersections were what fascinated me and compelled me. I left I finished my PhD program, but realized that academia felt too slow. I really appreciate, Steve, your urgency, right? Like, we are out of time, and we've been out of time for decades, right? And so the idea of having to publish several papers across 10 years in order to be able to come to a manager and say, I have an idea for you. Here's how I think we should manage the crab fishery and the tuna fishery together. Felt too slow. So I jumped into the private sector as a data scientist. I moved from commercial fisheries to large commodity agriculture. This was for two reasons. One, wild-caught fisheries felt like a really big impact space. But when you think about huge amounts of climate and biodiversity, commodity row crop ag is what needs to change. And in one of the many, it's always an England, right? It's not one thing. But that was one of the biggest places that I thought I'm going to put my shoulder against the wheel. The other thing I took away from my ecology program to all the economists, and then I'm going to be like, well, yeah, no duh, was incentives. Incentives matter so much, right? We're not in a command and control system, right? You can change policy, you can put out sort of recommendations, but unless you actually physically control where fishermen can fish, the cost benefit analysis obviously is going to drive what kind of price switching you do. And most of the papers were filled with, oh, without something is going to happen, but the fishermen understand the incentive structure, there's sort of value landscape, and so something else happened, right? That's like the same narrative again and again and again. So I wanted to sit alongside farmers and say, how do you make your decisions? What information are you faced with? How you choose corn versus soy versus wheat versus sorghum? How do you make those decisions? Fertilizer applications, how much do you put on? So I think the private sector offered me that like front row education for folks that are actually doing the actions that make the impacts. I also joined with the naive idea at the time that I wanted to try to align incentives and build programs that could do that. I was a consumer that would be willing to pay premiums for sustainably labeled X, Y, and Z. So I thought science is the answer. The limit here is metrics that really mean something. So I'm going to like the best butterfly metric of all time, right? And I'm going to do it. I'm going to like get it in. It's great, right? And the issue was there's no value, right? People will not pay for that in a commodity system. If you were buying feedlot beef, right, you would the cheapest cost of protein, you're not interested in offering a premium. The economic structure of that supply chain is highly consolidated. So folks that have leverage, they don't want to pay. They're not seeing value. And the farmers are not seeing a value. So one of the biggest takeaways that I have from working in agriculture is that we get what we pay for. And it's so simple and it's so obvious. But we realize what we pay for in commodity ag and in economies writ large, right? In commodity ag, it's corn and soy delivered everywhere, extremely high yields. And our system is amazing at doing that. It's amazing. What we don't pay for is erosion control, water quality, and habitat, right? And so we don't get it. And so I think that fundamentally what really comes down to most of the problems that I've seen from my perspective in the private sector is this lack of, there's no value. And there's not that there's no value, there's no value to the right actors, right? So I think there's a lot of analysis of broadly sort of the aggregate value of natural capital, but specifically thinking about who does that value accrue to in the system is incredibly important for driving change. And that I think there were several points that resonated so strongly coming from the policy side. that translation is so critical for private sector also. So the moment that I'm jumping around a little bit, but also built a soil carbon program at Corteva. So Corteva is one of the largest input companies. You might be more familiar with Monsanto as a brand. Corteva is like the US version of that. Right. So selling GM crops, pesticides and herbicides. And so the startup that I was a part of was acquired. So I stayed with Corteva to sort of understand how do they think about sustainability? How do big ships think about sustainability and risk on their landscape? And I think the two places that I came to Cruz on was one, market-based mechanisms have a real role to play. We built a large carbon program and within 12 months had scaled to more than 1 million acres by working within that really large channel. And we were able to pitch that business on value to the business, right? Revenue to farmers, improvement to their go-to-market channels, right? Their high-touch sales process with farmers actually was benefited by having a carbon program for them to talk about. We didn't frame it as a carbon program, but anyway, that like huge value, and that came entirely from aligning incentives, right? So I think that there's just tremendous value in that. But one of the challenges that I faced with that was Heather's point about we like to talk about all the uncertainties and all the new things, right? And the synthesis again is incredibly important also for the private sector to have evidence and confidence that this is real. So I think I can't emphasize also enough of that point that those papers are incredibly valuable. It was quite validating actually to hear that that's a shared experience and not just me being like, I don't know which paper to pull. So that's incredibly valuable combined with the translation. There's so many papers, especially I'm thinking about soil carbon and soil carbon uncertainty and sort of, what role does that have to play as a nature-based solution? There's so much focus and just I would say like first best, like completely precise estimates of what the both economic and environmental impacts are, and no sort of like what is accurate enough, what is good enough, what is that like what can we start moving on? Because at this point, if we have to wait for another 10 years to get to 0% uncertainty, like we're out of time. We're past 2030, like we just can't do that anymore. So I think identifying not only what's first best from a political or economic sort of perspective, but also from a rigor and uncertainty perspective, and having the academic community in particular be willing to put their voices behind this is probably good enough is incredibly valuable to unlock action across the landscape. And the last thing that I could share a little bit on is the current endeavor that I have taken on, which is co-founding the fintech startup around farmland investment. So again, I think I had often thought about paying for outcomes, paying for specifically environmental outcomes is the cleanest way to align incentives, right? I'm literally paying for the thing that I want. I want carbon sequestration. I'm going to pay a farmer for carbon sequestration. I'm going to let them figure out how to do it. That said, I think today there's a lot of other ways to identify co-benefits and sharing and aligning those incentives. So one realization that I had, for example, was carbon is a great way to pay farmers for adopting practices, but actually making a link between value increases can vastly outstrip the amount of value that a farmer gets relative to actual the carbon they sequester, right? So there's a lot of co-benefits that align with improved resiliency to extreme weather when you sort of improve the carbon capacity in the soil. And so being able to link that to land value will get us, hundreds of dollars an acre, whereas carbon will typically get us between maybe $20 to $30 an acre. So it's 2 to 3x by aligning those. So I think again, looking for where you can start to align incentives and with specific attention to who values and who has the action, I think was incredibly important. However you take the research, and then I can't emphasize enough the translation. If you can't write an explainer for someone who's not in your field, then you have not written anything that is going to be useful to anyone in the next 5 years. If you cannot link it, cannot like the plain speak. So I would take that as a challenge that I was not able to do as a PhD student for sure. And only now after being in the private sector can I start to write those. But there's been many different papers, at least in the ag space, that the units are wrong. The definitions of like, how would I map Midwest row crops to this like covariance space? I don't know, right? I have to like email the authors. I don't have time. Like it helps. So it's really basic translation stuff that I think can make a huge difference.
Thank you so much. So we're going to change gear yet again. As was mentioned, I work at the World Bank, and just in case people don't know what the World Bank is, it's this big organization that works in developing countries, and what we do is we give loans, very cheap loans at very good rates, despite what the papers might say. If anyone ever gave you a loan at that rate, you'd be delighted, you'd grab it and ask for more, because in 30 years you pay back a fraction after inflation. And there's grants, so money for nothing. And it's all for development. And the original mission of the World Bank has always been eliminating poverty.
And it's been very focused. We have probably the best poverty numbers, hundreds, if not thousands, of macroeconomists working on that theme. Small number of environmental economists. Very recently, about a year ago, our new president changed our mission, he altered it, to eliminating poverty on a livable planet. And that's a very, very major shift. So there's a question to you, how in a sentence, to go back to you, would you define a livable planet? That's going to be my job for the next 3 months. If you have any ideas, please do let me know. Email me. We'll invite you to give a seminar straight away. Okay, let me get to the topic over here. So before I get to the topic, let me say one more thing. The other great positive shift that I have seen over 15 years working at the World Bank was when I first arrived over there, we were overwhelmed by macroeconomists. People sort of kind of recognized climate change, but didn't think it was important, at least for macroeconomics. 15 years on today now, there will be a minority, if any left, who would not agree that climate change is an economically important and a macroeconomically material issue, especially in the countries in which we work, which are poor, that are grossly affected by climate change. You know, the climate change, the closer we're out of the tropics, the worse is the impact. And I think that's a huge, huge, huge change. But for those very same macroeconomists, if you mention biodiversity, they smile at you, they raise their eyebrows and say, you're a really nice person. But I have important things to do. Thank you very much. Right. So the point really is that whilst we might have made a very strong case that we have for climate change, we've not been able to convince people, I'm going to come back to this, that it's equally important for biodiversity. We see intellectually that there's a link between climate and biodiversity, between biodiversity and ecosystem services, etc. But to the same extent, it's much harder to do. And thank you, Steve, for all the work that you've done. And all the others around here, we really haven't done that in a way that we shouldn't, to the extent that we actually should. Which then gets me to what we see in the real world. And I do talk to policymakers in my day job and macroeconomists and all types. Climate change dominates when we're talking about environmental issues. And everyone in the areas in which I work worries so much about mitigation, but also adaptation. And of course, when you've got lots of money, you've got millions of dollars to talk about, to invest, because this is what countries give you, you go to what, solutions that seem to scale. And one that seems to scale, of course, is in the realm of water storage and hydropower. So let's take a specific example. You can go down the Amazon and there are plans, not World Bank plans. I need to re-emphasize that, not World Bank. But there are plans out there for roughly about 200 hydropower stations or water storage. So 200 along the Amazon. And of course, in the next breath, you go to the next meeting, you're talking to ecologists, and they tell you if the build was 200 dams, there's no Amazon left, right? So you can't have them both ways. So my first point is that more often than not, the policymakers aren't actually looking across the fences. I might get adaptation benefits, I might get clean energy, but what is the consequence of that? Of course, as academic economists, we understand that, but that hasn't got into the wider community. You think climate change is the most important thing. You're going to get these massive adaptation benefits. You go and you build. That's the first thing. Secondly, very, very seldom do you look at what the consequences are from building one dam to the next, to the next, to the next. Of course, we know, that there's a dynamic connection over there. You build the first one, you get depletion, and it just gets worse and worse. Very seldom do you look at what would happen if you build all 200 or 100 or whatever it might be. So if you started as you would, if you're solving a problem, mathematically from the end and work backwards, you wouldn't come to that solution. But in the real world, we don't actually do that. So, one of my sort of suggestions to all of you is that when you do your work, we need to really look across the spectrum as to what the impact is. Even when we try to do that, it's really difficult because there are some benefits and costs that we can count and monetize. And despite what was said by my colleagues over here, there are very many others related to biodiversity that we cannot monetize and cannot do it accurately. What is the value of a single species that's lost in a particular place? Very, very difficult to value that. We can put a number on that academically, but what does it actually mean for development? If you go to a president or a finance minister of a country and say, oh, if we lost species X in your country, this is the great loss that you're going to face. smile, politely offer you a cup of coffee, but that's going to be the extent of the influence you have. Again, it comes back to the fact, when it comes to biodiversity, is the case that we have made strong enough? Maybe two other points very quickly. When we look at least, I think maybe I'm wrong, I'm not a scientist and but a humble economist. When we look at where most of the really important biodiversity is, it's in the tropics, it's in the Amazon, it's in the Congo. A lot of the solutions that we come to today are suggesting to the poorest people on earth living in the Congo that they should not develop their economies, leave the Congo forest as it is. That's not a sustainable solution because they're not going to listen to us if we say that. And there isn't enough research that's happening that tells you how we can keep the Congo forest as well as develop and eliminate poverty, because we can't expect the poorest people on earth to pay for this global public good, i.e. biodiversity. Well, the few pieces of research, I'm sure there's others, but Steve has actually done, is identifying these places where we can actually expand agriculture without destroying the forest, without destroying biodiversity, where you can actually get win-wins. The point being a very simple one, Steve will talk about it much more, is that agriculture is really inefficient in these places. So by improving efficiency, we can get a lot of gain and eliminate poverty. But I would say that's the kind of actionable research that we actually want. And my last point really will be, as a point that was raised earlier, is, of course, in the academic literature, we always go for the first best. But as Steve said, the first best is not actionable. It's not what countries are looking for and what governments can actually do. There's no point in suggesting impose a carbon tax when you know that the day that you impose a carbon tax or begin to charge for water, or all the wonderful things that we actually want to do, means that you're not going to be in power at the next election. So it's not just a simple matter, very often which it is, of saying, okay, this is the first best subject to a political constraint. Often that will get us there. So, okay, maybe I can't introduce a carbon tax, but I can do something else, e.g. a subsidy, second best. That's a doable problem. A much harder problem is, like the places I was talking about, when we don't even share the same objective function, is that I want to have biodiversity, but you as the president or whatever it is, don't actually value it whatsoever. And then I think we need to think much more of this as being a principal agent problem. You are the agent. I'm the principal. I know what your incentives are. What is a policy constraint in a policy space? And what are the feasible policies that will persuade you to actually do what we would like you to do, in this case, biodiversity. So I would think of this as being a vast area of really, really important policy research, whether you're doing it empirically or you're doing it theoretically, but by Jove, it would be useful. And then just to echo the point, unless you can translate the economics into very plain speaking, simple English, 3 sentences, 4 sentences max, you lose people that are really important about so many things. If you can't convey your idea in 3 sentences, you probably haven't got the entry. Then, once you've got the 3 sentences, you've got their attention, you have no time. So, what is your elevator pitch on that? With that, let me in. Thank you so much.
So the video going last is that I can keep my comments very short because everybody has already said many of the things that I think I might have commented on. First, just thanks Steve and Eyal for preparing this panel, because I think that all of these issues that have been raised here are incredibly important. So bringing to in some sense, we're preaching to the choir here, but I think that raising awareness and thinking about ways in which we can contribute is a really important part of what we're trying to do here. So let me just make a couple of brief comments that, again, are going to echo some of the things that other panelists have already said. So first, of course, as we recognize, there is a strong connection between land use, biodiversity, and climate. And so many of the conservation policies and nature-based solutions that have been mentioned in the comments already will have implications for climate, right? Whether it's implications in terms of adaptation or mitigation. And so that connection, I think, is well recognized, but not always incorporated. As Steve mentioned, we often, for the most part, have sort of separate processes that look at biodiversity, whether it's international conventions or whatever, look at biodiversity versus climate, and not at the connection between the two. And the fact that when you're doing one, you could potentially benefit others. So Emma mentioned co-benefits. We don't usually use that term, I think, in this context, but if this is the context, really what we have here are potentially co-benefits of increased biodiversity from doing something that's good for the climate, or conversely, good co-benefits in terms of climate, doing something that's good for biodiversity. But also important to recognize that that is not always the case. And so there are cases where when you do something that might be good from one perspective, it's not necessarily good from the other perspective, from a biodiversity perspective. So Richard mentioned, for instance, building a lot of hydro dams. It might be a good thing from a climate perspective, but from a biodiversity perspective, it could have some pretty negative impacts. We certainly know what happened when we had all the incentives for biofuels and what that creates in terms of the implications for deforestation and things like that. Even things like utility level solar, and if you're putting that in farming, what is the implication of that, depending on how you do it, what kinds of impacts does that change in the land use have on biodiversity. And of course, when we promote climate change policies that are based on increased electrification, increased batteries, and increased mining of mineral minerals and things like that. There are clearly land use implications, as well as deep sea implications of those kinds of climate policies. And so in some cases, we have complements in some sense between biodiversity and climate. And in some cases, I think there is the potential for these two to be different objectives, as Richard mentioned, and then depending on how much of those that you're concerned about, you might focus on one, but without adequately accounting for the other. So I think one of the things we want to look for is places where we can get both in some sense, and we might think about those as sort of a win-win, and we might be in terms of climate and biodiversity, but we have to recognize that that doesn't mean they're costless. And I think what Emma pointed out was that these are win-win in terms of public goods, but there still are individual costs to the individual landowners who are potentially providing those public goods. And this, I think, speaks also to Richard's point about poverty, because if you're taking land out of production, it's negatively impacting the livelihoods of people who need to rely on that resource. And so that suggests that we need to think more holistically, not only about in terms of biodiversity and climate, but also can it be for the people who are providing those services. And if it's efficient, then presumably overall it should be net beneficial. And the question is, can we design the policies in such a way that we share those benefits so that those people who are on the cost side of those actually can benefit and thereby support those policies as well? Because if they aren't benefiting from it, obviously we're going to see the kind of opposition that makes it difficult to pass policies that are beneficial from an efficiency point of view, and certainly from the climate and biodiversity point of view. So I think just briefly what it means is that when we think about policy, we want to think about policies that are achievable, actionable, et cetera, the terminology that's been used here, not just necessarily the first best types of carbon taxes or biodiversity loss, deforestation taxes that we think about in some contexts. So we heard a lot yesterday from the panel that Joe Aldi organized about different policies that are in place for climate, all of the massive investments that are being through the IRA and through infrastructure laws, et cetera. So we've got a lot of that. But much of that isn't really thinking about the biodiversity implications of that huge set of investments. I mean, Heather was talking about the investments and the types of things that are being focused on biodiversity, but is climate being factored into that? So I think the point here is that we want to think a little bit more holistically about them. Those are policies that are actually obviously being implemented right now, and so they're feasible by definition in some states. To be feasible. The other set of policies, of course, are things like payments for ecosystem services of the type that Emma talked about, with the private sector offset programs and things like that. Those are these feasible, if you will, policies, whether they be subsidies or PES type programs, involve payments. And I think one of the things that the literature in environmental economics and use of voluntary approaches tells us is that you need strong incentives for people to be willing to participate in these programs if you're not going to use a regulatory or a more mandatory approach that forces them to participate. So if participation is voluntary, we need something to incentivize that. And so that can be payments. It can be market incentives, but those often aren't very strong, as Emma mentioned, that the people aren't willing to pay a lot more for a product that is more environmentally friendly than those market-based incentives are not going to be really effective. And if another type of incentive that works is if they have a strong regulatory threat, but in this context, in many of these contexts, particularly in the agricultural context, we don't have the political will for that kind of a regulatory threat either. So that's why we, in some sense, fall back on payment-based mechanisms. Now, I think one of the really interesting things from an economic perspective here is that when we move to the like PES programs, we're into the world of markets, and of course, economists can understand the supply side and the demand side of that, and the importance of thinking about who's going to participate in these markets, what are the incentives for participation. And then once they participate, what are they going to do? Like how much additional conservation or climate protection or whatever are you going to get out of those kinds of efforts? And I think this is an area where economists can contribute a lot to understanding the demand side of the market, the supply side of the market, and seeing what's likely to be effective and how effective that is. Is that going to get us? How far is that going to get us for the goal that we need? I think that there are ways in which we're pretty in terms, in some contexts at least, in terms of the extent to which we can rely on those market mechanisms and those voluntary approaches. So again, I would suggest that thinking about climate and biodiversity as co-benefits in some sense of some policies. There was some work a couple of years back where people talked about credit stacking, recognizing the co-benefits from carbon sequestration and water quality. And I think maybe this is an area that we could resurrect some of the discussion from that and use it to think about the synergies here as well.
So please join me in thanking five panelists for a great job. So they've given us plenty to think about. So we have about half an hour for questions and answers. I don't know if, to get us started, I don't know if you want to ask the first question. Or, okay, and then we're going to open it up. So have your questions ready.
As you think of the questions, I will simply ask you really kind of like 3 sentences like Richard said. What is either a win-win in the world of climate change and biodiversity, or a trade-off that we need to quantify and better understand, which I think is like of urgency, and you want the people in the room to work on? Like really a minute, 3 sentences, either a win-win or a trade-off that we need to know more about.
Watershed investment for water supply systems as potential win-win, where investments in reforestation, forest protection, agroforestry, pasture management, crop management, et cetera, all can contribute to really important biodiversity benefits and potentially, depending on how it's managed, climate benefits. Established in many places, invested in by the Inter-American Development Bank as part of a core loan to a water infrastructure system in Brazil 10 years ago. And I haven't heard of any other examples since. So more.
Forest and agricultural landscape restoration, especially in developing countries where it's already integrated productivity for forestry, agriculture, and incomes, and by restoring those achieving benefits both in terms of production side, forestry, agriculture, and incomes, and also by the use of climate. Thanks.
I have a similar theme. I'm thinking about the U.S. context for row crops. I would love to see an analysis that looks at low productivity landscapes and how much we could restore back to native habitats, and the benefit uplift for both biodiversity and carbon sequestration, along with improved profitability.
So Robert tries for anyone that can come up with what is the strategy for places such as in Brazil or in the Congo? Who can be healthy without destroying the Congo forest and keep your biodiversity?
Well, I'll just mention one context that I think we haven't mentioned here, and that has to do with increased electrification, and that the increased demand for electricity, that's only going to help us in our goals if we can run the grid. So that's something that we talked about, but I think that's important.
Okay, let's turn it over to you all. And what questions do you have here for the panelists? So. in the way back. And I don't know that we have microphones to get back, so speak up.
Not for responding, I think. My biggest question for all the panelists would be that we're trying to align economics with conservation and climate change and try to, well, make everyone better off. But my question is like, can we align economics, especially mainstream economics, and all the hard assumptions that we have in economics towards these goals? How we actually do, how, as you say at the end, like making people in Brazil and the results, what does that mean and how we can actually align what we know about economics? Should we start thinking in a different economics and different assumptions, or we are too late and we just need to have what we have and what we not?
Okay, yeah. So the question, and please help me if I get it wrong, but basically, how do we align, or can we actually align economics with these conservation and climate goals? Are there things that need to change, like among some of our assumptions, or is it consistent? That fair enough?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
I don't have an answer, but what I would say is that the question is probably the most foundational question in economics of the 21st century. Can we grow the economy, grow the world by enhancing the environment rather than depleting it? Because the growth model we've had so far, massive increases in living standards, a drop in infant mortality, blah, blah, has come at the cost of the environment. How do we reconcile the two? I think we know how to do it in theory. It's shifting towards the production frontier. It is investments in new technology, et cetera, et cetera. It's translating from the theory into the practice. And what are the policy hurdles that we actually have? So it's not going to be any one policy, but we know the big policy shifts that you actually need in terms of the incentives, the technology, and so on. I think the big hurdles are, why isn't it happening? It's the political economy of change, which is keeping us from that.
Following up on this, well, like to there's feasible to fully reconcile economic growth and just conservation and biodiversity. There are not many, if any, examples of countries that have grown their economy and well-being in a significant way without sacrificing on the environment. And those examples that have been able to achieve a reduction of fossil biodiversity loss often by saying that at the expense of outsourcing those impacts elsewhere. So whatever has led to this in the grand model, I think the evidence is clear that it's the same model, similar trends probably will continue. But I do think that there's a great deal of interest in addressing that question moving forward, because especially in the nature context, the response for living nature is becoming strong. And just the ecological basis of when that's the case, you end up losing that. So that is the expense that comes from the current model. So if we could address that problem, that would be great. I think that's was interested in this topic to work on. Thanks.
So I want to put in, I'll let you go next, but I want to put in my own 2 cents here as a moderator. I mean, it's a great question. And I often face this because I go back and forth between an ecology department and an economics department. So we can't align these 2 disciplines that might, I have to split myself in 2 or, I had a more serious problem probably. But, I think actually in doing this kind of work of integrating the natural sciences and economics, I view myself as just being a good economist. It's not just the marketed goods and services we care about. We care about all goods and services, whether they're public goods or externalities, right? So being a good economist says, if you're going to do cost benefit analysis, you're going to actually evaluate all the costs and benefits of your action. And so much of what we're doing, and Juha, you're talking about GDP. We know GDP is not the right measure. Right? There are other measures of things that go outside of GDP. That is, if we were good economists, we would actually be incorporating those in our decisions. So fundamentally, we want to think about what's good for human well-being not just growing GDP. So the right measure is, are we doing well for human well-being, both currently and in the future? And as good economists, we're using the available resources that we have to make decisions and allocations so that we're actually making decisions that maximize the net benefits, right? But that means that we have to do our job as environmental economists of actually measuring what all of those costs and benefits are, not just the ones that are marketed, but the whole range of them. And then taking Emma's question really seriously too. It's not just saying this in general, because yes, we can write a nice paper that says in general, we should be doing X, which is good for, conservation. It's also good for human well-being, but then showing who's it good for? Like, what is the person who's making the critical decision? Are they better off? And if they're not, how do we get Heather and others to change the policy arrangements so that we actually do get this? But that's just good economics to my point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think that fundamentally we're not going to the fact that certain types of activities are going to cause damage, and those are things that we value. But what we do is move to a world where those damages are much smaller than they are now, and recognize that in the course of doing that, there are still some people that could. So there's a lot of discussion about just transitions and what does it mean to have a just transition. I think that's what we. It doesn't mean I can't move in those directions. It's just we need to think about these things as we do it.
So I think something that Steve said at the beginning, we've had scientists from climate sciences and from ecology tell us for a long time that we have a problem. And in response, economists have, more slowly than we should have, or just at the right time, we've started assessing and quantifying and documenting what some of the impacts of those problems that scientists have been doing their long bells for. And then there's the next step that I think speaks to your question about, okay, what are going to be the solutions, how to move towards like a different equilibrium, a different trajectory. I think that's going to need to come in response to policymakers and societies and at a local and a global level of deciding what are the targets, what are the goals. And that's something that economists either as a cop-out or truly being mindful of like, we do the best in those discussions, that we can help with steering the direction, or at least like say what's the first best solution, what's the second best solution, what are different mechanisms of arriving at those goals. I don't think we necessarily need to reinvent the wheel, but again, speaking to Steve's earlier comment, there's some urgency here that we haven't fully recognized yet, and probably need to just like be very blatant about like where we want to be until 2030 work. And then economists probably need to step up and say, okay, if that's the goal, here's the game plan that we think we better set.
Well, you got us going. That was a great question. Yeah, okay.
So a number of you have alluded to the political constraints to sort of the policies that we might typically recommend. The big theme of yesterday's panel too, or the big takeaway was carrots up on palatable sticks. In the biodiversity and ecosystem services setting, carrots might still be first best. So I'm wondering if you could give us maybe a perspective on what are the other unique to biodiversity constraints that we should have in mind.
Great. Okay. So you want me to repeat? Okay. Could we repeat questions? We're talking a lot about the policy constraints, and in particular, thinking about carrots and sticks. It was discussed yesterday in climate, but what are the kind of unique features here in biodiversity that we should be thinking about in terms of policy constraints?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time answering this briefly, but I guess it's a boring thing to say, but I mean, I think in this room and maybe most audiences of some kind of academic background, you say biodiversity, probably at least some of you are not just thinking about owls and butterflies. Hopefully some of you are thinking about ecosystems and biogeochemical processes and the fact that the climate is part of the environment. It's not a separate thing. And when you say biodiversity in most policy contexts, people might think of a species. And so that's a huge constraint, because the realm of possibility for what is relevant is incredibly constrained. So it's not in anyone's front of mind that biodiversity means flood risk reduction, or that biodiversity means heat stress reduction, or that biodiversity means crop productivity even in a lot of contexts. And so the mental gap between the word and the policies that might be relevant is enormous for most decision makers. And that's on us a lot, not necessarily on them. So I think, many of the policy tools in the toolbox are directly relevant to biodiversity. And many of those policies are not environmental policies, right? They are every other kind of policy that could be a biodiversity policy if implemented with nature in mind. And that starting point is not present for most decision makers. So I just think even the term, we were the nature team and we did a lot of work on nature. And everybody in the science world kept asking me, why aren't you talking about biodiversity? Like, because people think I'm talking about bugs. And I want to talk about more than bugs. So we're going to talk about nature. And even that shift doesn't always help, but it is something. And I think people really need to understand the barrier that's put up by language and the very narrow space that people imagine when you say biodiversity policy. It is very, very, very different than what probably you imagine biodiversity policy could be. So I don't see hardly any specific policy instrument constraints. I see huge constraints in people's imagination of what kinds of policies could be relevant to biodiversity and how biodiversity could be relevant to their policies.
One thing I would add to what we've emphasized here, which is biodiversity can be highly localized and highly spatially variable. And so who that gets value out of this and who pays the cost, the trade-offs specifically on the actors is incredibly, incredibly important because to some point maximizing that benefit actually means zero things to anyone who actually is trying to make a solution work on the ground.
On comparisons and versus things, I going to take that one is both. So, parents along with us in the bottom, a bit of a stick there to drive the action. And especially in the positive space, there's a lot of discussion and sort of assurance that voluntary action will take care of the problem if corporations, finance sector can bring ownership of the issue and we can somehow solve the problem. And it just seems that there's a bit of interest by some actors to do just that. But I find it difficult to envision that the solution will take place at the scale needed unless it's there's some sort of regulatory policy driving that, maybe some mandatory action that is driving that kind of action for carrots. So both carrots and sticks. Thanks.
Just add one. I don't thought about that. What's different because I thought a lot about the differences between the challenges in the field of biodiversity versus climate change. I think that when talking to policymakers about climate change, not that literature or that domain has it easy, but they started talking about there's some concentration of greenhouse gases. People can wrap their minds around that. Talking about temperature and precipitation. We have measurement of that. We've experienced that. We start talking to them about ecosystem functioning and biodiversity and explain to them, well, there's a lot to talk about there, about there's abundance, there's diversity of species, there's diversity of functional traits, and they're just like, what? And they're like, there's also genetic diversity. And I remember reading and having conversations with people involved with the IPPS first assessment, we're just defining the problem was taking a lot longer than they expected. So even in academia, it's hard for us to agree on how we measure and what we define as a key metric. And then having those conversations with policymakers is very much complicating the political economy aspect of that for sure.
Okay, Alan.
I wanted to get more specific about a particular trade-off that I think a lot about. It's climate versus biodiversity, which is we're going to need a huge network of CO2 pipelines to sequester, to get the CO2 to places where it can be sequestered. We may need hydrogen pipelines, depending on a lot of things. So does any of the panelists, do you have your sort of favorite way of minimizing this trade-off? There's policy solutions or more technical solutions. Just curious about that. We're going to face, and it's the habitat fragmentation specifically that I'm concerned about here.
Yeah, so the question more specifically on trade-offs of climate and biodiversity when thinking about pipelines, CO2 pipelines and hydrogen pipelines and fragmentation.
I mean, I think that there's in some of the infrastructure funding, right, that opens the opportunity for nature-based approaches to resilience. There's an open door for new pipeline design and development to think about and consider corridor connectivity and risk reduction to that infrastructure via, habitat management alongside pipelines. There's not that I'm aware of direct incentives specifically for that, but there's an open door for that to be part of what is proposed now for multiple programs that are paying for infrastructure development, including for pipelines. I will say, I'm just going to channel my husband, who's an environmental consultant, who's currently working with a large company who has extensive pipelines already through North America, that's asked that company for advice on how they should be thinking about biodiversity in their corridor and what their options are for managing the leeways around them differently, what the costs of those alternatives would be, what kind of credits they can get if they do pollinator habitat or other habitat in those corridor areas. So that's a voluntary question that a company is willing to pay for the private sector to help them look at. I think in part anticipating some of the EU regulations, but also looking for business opportunities for them to manage that area in a different way. So to me, that's encouraging, but a lot more, would need to come into play for that to become a kind of common practice.
Yeah, I don't make a quick answer. Aaron, you and I are co-authors of a paper that addresses that's a very specific question on the Connecticut shale gas. Well, it's a while back. So I think but just to add to that, and good coordination, I think will be to the biodiversity and other aspects of the pipeline infrastructure. But also, we're trying to avoid, may not be a problem in the US, but elsewhere, definitely. Try to avoid multiple networks, try to coordinate in a way that everybody establish their own pipeline networks, try to do that in a coordinated fashion. And I believe that's the footprint. Thanks. Wait.
Next question. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Amy. Yeah.
Thanks, so this is really great. I just wanted to pick up on a conversation that started. We all need to work on translating our research into the general public, short, simple. But often, even when we come to do that, we use language that just stops the conversation. So I'm at United States. I talk a lot of farmers. I don't talk about people on here about climate change, but we'll talk about that. We'll talk about everything. Like that's one example. But in your experience, I love the diversity experience. What are some phrases that we always use that we should that stop conversations, but also are there framings that you're finding are really positive? You can work with your start conversations. How do we think that changing?
Great. So the importance of communication and language, and are there things that we should stop saying because they stop the conversation, and are there better ways that we can frame it to help that conversation along?
I'll just start really quick. That's been I really appreciate the question. It's been my entire career, actually. I've been leaving academia to being in the private sector, and specifically being in the private sector that is very conventional and very uninterested in climate change, biodiversity. Those are words that I never use the word biodiversity for the same reason. I mean, if I do, then I'm like, it's like, they're great. Biodiversity is in this species. So biodiversity and climate change are, first of all, like immediate, like if you're using these words, you have to be very careful about the audience that you're addressing and thinking about what kind of connotations they have, or if there's actually any meaning there for them. The thing that I found, I mean, we're working, it sounds like similar segments. I'm working with large row crop operators, Ohio, Minnesota. That's like my home turf, but I think what is especially important is starting from a position of mutual respect, right? We're all trying to live in this world the best that we can. And the idea that someone is a villain, even if they're a giant corporation and you really object to the practices, they're trying to maximize their own perceived utility, right? We all know that. That's like a fundamental assumption here. And I think this is especially acute in my personal experience of working with farmers, right? We like to demonize large row crop operators and commodity crops as the bad guys. They grow that. No one loves corn. I mean, some people do, but like most people do not intrinsically love commodity corn. What they do is that is the highest cash flow that they can get, right? And that's why they grow it, right? Like there's a reason they don't grow sorghum. There's a reason they don't grow oats, right? There's no market for it. And so I think starting from that position of like, we're all trying to do the right thing and understanding where folks are coming from is an incredibly powerful way to start opening the conversation to try to identify the shared objective function. Because if you don't have a shared objective function, you might as well go home with your technical analysis and like not write the paper.
Yeah, I think we also confront situations taken from when we have a shared objective function, we can start a conversation, right? But we often don't have a shared objective function. And that's where it becomes much, much harder. And I think there the challenge is how we can find a middle ground or something that you like that I also want that helps to achieve that objective simultaneously. So it may be more than what you want than what I want. Knowing there's a principal agent problem and knowing that one side has more rents or more power than the other, that's as good as you can actually get. And if you don't understand the incentives on the other side, you end up doing exactly the wrong thing. So we often routinely ask for stricter environmental regulations, be it water quality, be it whatever. When you have very low capacity and high rent seeking, what happens? And the greater the pipeline of regulation, the greater the leakage that you get, the more corruption that you get, no real outcome. So part of that, speaking the same language, is understanding the objectives, understanding what's feasible, and really knowing at the end of the day, it's regrettably, it's going to be money, right? That matters. And if you speak in the language of money, you probably have an audience, otherwise probably not.
Concepts to avoid where you are. Because the number two would be a central planner. Once you got a central planner, it doesn't work anywhere. Then a broader is put on the dictator. That is also a good one to avoid. And just not going back to the knowledge, but also just kind of approach and thinking. It's good to there and try not to think about too much from the top down. Thanks.
Like Juha's. I'm going to give two specifics. One directly on Richard's. I mean, I, as much as I humanly possibly can now, just start with somebody else's objective. Because that's who you're talking to. And what do you want to hear about? Your objective, right? And so if you are immediately speaking about the objective of the person that you're communicating to in the words that they use to speak about that objective, you're on their turf. And if that's your job to make that translation. It's not their job to hear you say biodiversity and be able to turn it into their objective. And so starting with the objectives you are speaking to is critical and will immediately change the conversation. And I have published many papers that say co-benefits and multiple benefits, and I'm never using those terms again. I'm learning because what is a co-benefit? Not my benefit, right? And who manages multiple benefits? Almost nobody, right? And so when you put out a paper that says, here's all these benefit flows, none of them are going to a single decision maker. You're talking about, if you have 15 benefits, you're probably talking about at least 5 decision makers. And so that's not someone's objective. That's a bunch of people's objective and a lot of work for them to figure out. And, if you take a private person's situation and, I'm going to get the direct benefit from crop yields and you're telling me there's 15 other ones that I'm talking about me. So where are we going? So start with their objectives and primarily their objectives. If you can find words that make sense to them to speak about other benefits for other reasons, fine. But they're not co-benefits and they're not multiple benefits. They're other things that other real people care about. So I think it is really important. The other one I want to hammer on a little is uncertainty being replaced by risk. So lots of people manage risk. all the time, and they know what risk is. And there's industries about risk, and companies manage risk, and governments manage risk. Uncertainty means stop. Risk means manage it, right? So I think it's a huge, important shift also. And Steve and I worked a lot in a natural capital project on different scenario analysis. And the academic gut instinct in scenario analysis is to say a lot about the uncertainty between the options. The decision maker message is, can I differentiate these options or not? If I can differentiate them, tell me that, and tell me which one does what. If you can't differentiate them, the message is not, we don't have enough uncertainty. The message is, make either decision. Right now, from my perspective, they're the same, right? I can't tell you a difference between those options. That is completely different than saying, we don't have enough certainty to make a decision. They're going to make a decision. So what is the risk profile around that decision? And the other thing I'll say about this is different decision makers have different risk tolerances. So we very, very often assume that any uncertainty means stop, right? And for tons of decisions, there's more risk tolerance than we're assuming. So again, it's on us to understand the risk profile of the decision makers that we're talking about and communicate uncertainty to their tolerance. So those are the big shifts that people can make in language and communication that will completely change the openness to the discussion.
Great. Okay. We're going to wrap it up. We're at time. We're past. I just want to say thanks to all the panelists and also to you for the provocative questions. And it's kind of the last word. I think what you heard here is there's an urgency to these issues, and there are ways of getting progress. And we need you all to join in making progress on these issues. So thanks very much.
We haven't had even one, but I wanted to thank you all of you there and
Yes, no. I think my experience with buildings are not being able to supply right, like I'm ready to 7 years ago, right, but it's still a difference. It's like anyway, so like that kind of stuff. So there will be conversation, right? There's the residents. So we're just going to be a consensus item. Yes, I would. Yeah, yeah, and but it's. I need to reach out. I wish I read that about this. So that this, I'm gonna say that. It's the same moment. So